Thank you, comrades, in joining me in this short film entitled The Dismantling of the USSR. I hope to prove with the help of 3 events that the USSR did not collapse, and this is actually a bourgeois myth. We must get rid of the word collapse when it comes to the terrible events of the late 1980s and the early 1990s in the USSR. The word collapse is used by the bourgeois and the enemies of socialism to belittle the achievements of that great country and to try and underline the falsehood that the socialist system in some way did not work. Let us take a bit of time to demythologize another favourite idea of the bourgeois and the enemies of socialism, that of the era of stagnation. This is roughly considered the period when Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982 and de facto head of state. Although the onset of revisionism had taken its toll and the USSR was slowly on the road to capitalist decline, the socialist system was largely intact, and even in its restricted, semi-revisionist form, still outshone capitalism on many fronts. Now, I don't want to discuss the nitty-gritty of revisionism in this film. I want to demythologize the words of the enemy about our socialist project in the USSR. When we talk about stagnation, we think about things slowly grinding to a halt and things basically not changing, not growing and slowly dying. I don't think this was the case in the times of Brezhnev or his leadership. Yes, there were problems, but I don't think we can call these problems stagnation. Let us first look at some facts and figures. As we can see on the screen, the epoch of stagnation was anything but, and by 1986 the USSR, from its humble beginnings in 1917, had actually become the world leader in the production of oil, gas, tractors, steel, and so on. What do the figures look like for capitalist Russia today? Well, may I say, not very favourable. Yes, many factories have been built by private companies from foreign countries with private interests, but still not as many as were built in the days of so-called stagnation. 90% of the population of the Russian Federation live in houses or flats built in Brezhnev's time. Only private schools have been built in the last 20 years in the Russian Federation, and no universities. On Victory Day, the 9th of May, Russia's proudest day at the moment, Russia holds its annual military parade. None of the military vehicles on display were designed in the last 20 years, or even the paint that covers them. They were all made and created by Soviet designers in Soviet-made factories. I think it is interesting to compare the epochs because I think we can see where the real stagnation lies, and that is not under a socialist system that still worked in many respects. That is under a stale and rotten capitalist system that to the core is falling to pieces. Not so long ago, a Russian government poll found that 80% of those born between the years of 1960 and 1970 remember Brezhnev's time as the happiest time in their lives. All had guaranteed work, pensions after work, free education and free healthcare. I think, comrades, some of us would like a little bit of that stagnation now. Another gripe we hear from our bourgeois whingers is that the USSR had a big black market for everyday goods. This is also a falsehood. The big deficits came during Gorbachev's so-called reforms. But whatever the size of the black market, it could never be as big as the black market of drugs and prostitution in the Western world, led of course by the USA. Drugs and prostitution did not really exist in socialist countries, and this goes for the USSR too. So the socialist economy was not stagnating. What was happening? Well, after the awful years of Khrushchevite revisionism, the USSR was struggling to put itself back on the path of socialism. Traitors and spies gained influence in major parts of the structure of the Soviet Union and fed the people nonsense about the need for change and the need for consumer products. Now I would like to come on to our first event for analysis. Let us jump forward a bit to Gorbachev. Gorbachev and his lackeys have already done the damage. They have presided over counter-revolutions in Eastern Europe, and now they are turning their attention to dismantling socialism at home. Only he's not going fast enough, and the West puts all its hope into a provincial alcoholic called Boris Yeltsin. On the 17th of March 1991, it was decided to hold a referendum for the very life of the USSR. Gorbachev, who realised that his Western paymasters were losing faith in him, thought that he could gain some ground back and oust the upcoming Yeltsin, who was then president of the USSR. The referendum was worded thus: do you consider necessary the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedom of an individual of any nationality will be fully guaranteed? And the answers could be given as yes or no. The key word here is preservation. All the rest, about rights and freedoms and so on, were already guaranteed in the Constitution of the USSR. The outcome was thus: 77% of all those who took part in the referendum voted yes. Yes to the preservation of the USSR, and hence yes to the socialist system. Some may argue that the people voting yes for the preservation of the USSR were not voting for the socialist system, but were merely voting for their country. I think most Soviet citizens understood quite clearly under what system they lived, and needed no talk about countries or fatherlands to understand this. Chapter 2, Article 10 of the Constitution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic states: the foundation of the economic system of the USSR is socialist ownership of the means of production in the form of state property belonging to the people and collective farm and cooperative property. I think that people voting yes in this referendum were not only voting for their country, but for the preservation of their own social system. Of course, a few countries and citizens of a few Soviet republics were not allowed to take part in the referendum, these mainly being Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia and Georgia, which had some time before torn away from the socialist system, or were torn away by traitors in their own governments. No doubt, if the people of these Soviet Socialist Republics were allowed the chance, they too would have voted for, and 77 would have looked more like 85 or 90%. This brings us on to event number 2, the Bielorussia Accords. Boris Yeltsin was highly dissatisfied by the result of his referendum, as were his Western paymasters. Together with two bourgeois agents, President Leonid Kravchuk of the Ukraine and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus, both renowned fascists, both who brought back the fascist flags to their countries that had been beaten off by the partisan fighters of Belarus and Ukraine during World War II. They had decided that by any means necessary they would dissolve the USSR regardless of the outcome of the referendum. They claimed that after the referendum the leaders of the Union republics had been in constant dialogue, and that this dialogue had come to a dead end. Of course, this is lies and propaganda. So, the three leaders, and I would like to emphasise this, that there was only three leaders of the Union Republics, came together in Belarus on the 8th of December 1991 and effectively killed the USSR by signing the Bielorussia Accords. These accords agreed to the fact that they wanted to play out and believe that the Soviet Union no longer existed and the Union Republics should go their own way. Only three came together and only three signed the original agreement. Some Soviet Socialist republics did not sign this agreement until 1994. The other Soviet republics, seeing that it was a fait accompli, that the three most important, probably, Soviet Socialist republics had essentially got rid of their country, followed suit quickly in order not to get bogged down by Western imperialism. So what happened? The country was dismantled against the will of the people. The leadership of the Soviet Union, rotten and ridden with spies due to the years of revisionism, could no longer fulfill its socialist role as the leaders of the people and essentially signed their own death warrants but filled their bank accounts. The Soviet Union did not collapse. This is a myth. The socialist system, far from collapsing, worked to the charging of the capitalists in the West, and hence plans were furiously created to bring it down. I believe that these two events alone prove that the USSR, far from collapsing, could have been preserved, but a corrupt leadership ridden with spies and enemies went against the will of the people. The socialist system did not collapse, and the majority of people wanted to keep it. The socialist economic system was being slowly undermined since 1956 by the Khrushchevite revision. But in essence, it still existed. Gorbachev's reforms, in brackets, finally killed it off. And the USSR was being dismantled. But socialism and the Soviet motherland were not completely erased from the minds and hearts of the people. This brings me on to our last and sad event. The siege of the Russian White House on the 3rd of October 1993. The Russian people, who are by this time fed up by the traitorous capitalist politics of Yeltsin and his gang, had voted in a parliament dominated by communists, socialists and nationalists. The parliament of the then Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was still called the Supreme Soviet. The Soviet system still existed on paper, and the people's deputies had called for the resignation of Boris Yeltsin. The Russian people had again found their voice and wanted to get rid of Yeltsin and his capitalist gang. They had beaten Yeltsin at his own game and filmed the Supreme Soviet with supporters of socialism and the USSR. The major argument came when Yeltsin insisted that the name of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic be changed to the Russian Federation as it is now. The people and their representatives in the Supreme Soviet could stand no more and declared that it was either the president that would step down or that he would forcibly have to evict them from their deputies' changes. A fierce exchange and battle took place on the night of the 3rd and 4th October. And Yeltsin, turning tanks of the Russian army onto its own parliament, sadly came out victorious. He did this with the full appraisal of his Western paymasters and the newly created oligarch class which had torn up the Soviet Union. The military units he used were newly created ones that were formed with the help of the USA and NATO. Most military units stayed loyal to their country, and most who were not from Moscow and who were not under the tutelage of NATO actually defected to the People's Deputies in the Supreme Soviet. The deputies' actions were heroic, and it seemed that the Russian working class had once again risen up to show the world what it could do. But in the morning of the 4th, the criminal actions of Boris Yeltsin had become apparent. 157 people had been killed and 384 injured. The Russia of 1993 looks sadly very similar to the Russia of 1905. But of course, comrades, we all know what happened after 1905. The Russian people again found their voice, and in 1917 heralded in a new dawn for the human race. So a small defeat by the Russian working class of 1993 will turn into a big victory of the Russian working class in future years. The working class movement has taken a huge blow with the dismantling of the USSR, as it did with the defeat of the Paris Commune of 1871. But it is important to value the memory of both these socialist societies, and most of all that both prove that socialism is the next stage of historical development, and that these temporary setbacks cannot hold back the world revolution. They only prove its inevitability. The USSR proved that socialism not only works, but is inevitable. And the only thing that can bring it down is a revision of the socialist ideology and a revision of its greatest leaders. The USSR and socialism did not collapse. They were both dismantled to a plan hatched in the Pentagon and Langley for many years. I believe, comrades, that with these events I have proven that the collapse of the Soviet Union is a myth. That the myth of stagnation has been put into our minds by bourgeois agents and revisionists within the movement. That socialism was vibrant in the Soviet Union and would have lasted a long time, possibly until its triumphal march into communism. But we can't look at that now. What has happened, and we have to see facts and events in the full light and understand. For our movement to go forward, we have to correctly analyse what has taken place. And what had taken place was not a fault of the socialist system, a fault of the theories of Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. It was the creeping and crawling to power of revisionists in the 1950s who had long hidden in the bosom of socialism. Socialism is a class-based society, as is capitalism. Only in socialism, the majority of people have finally taken power of their own means of production, and they are beating the capitalist ideology physically and spiritually every day. And this battle, this struggle goes on until mankind reaches communism. And of course, inside socialism, there will be contradictions, there will be reverses, and there will be victories for the working class. But if we allow to happen what happened in 1956 again, then we will make the same mistakes, and socialist systems that exist today or that will exist in the future will inevitably fall down the sorry path of a once great nation, the Soviet Union. Revisionism, comrades, is our greatest enemy, and the bourgeois lies and mystification about possibly the greatest endeavour the human race has ever embarked upon must be challenged every day and every night. Comrades, I thank you all for your attention, and I hope that you will join in me in debunking the myth of the so-called collapse of the Soviet Union, and the so-called collapse of the socialist system. Thank you.
Колеса диктуют вагонные, где срочно увидеться нам. Мои номера телефонные разбросаны по городам. Заботится сердце, сердце волнуется, почтовый пакуется груз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Вы точки тире телеграфные, ищите на стройках меня. Сегодня не личное, главное, а сводки рабочего дня. Заботится сердце, сердце волнуется, почтовый пакуется груз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Я там, где ребята толковые, я там, где плакаты вперед, где песни рабочие, новые, страна трудовая поет. Заботится сердце, сердце волнуется, почтовый пакуется груз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз.